Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. You may recall the Trudeau-led Liberal government passed a law that required provinces and territories to implement a carbon tax by January 1st, 2019. If they didn't adopt anything, they would face one imposed by the federal government. All of this was done to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, which called for a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. 3 provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, took issue with this mandated carbon tax and took the case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. Well, in late March 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada issued its long-awaited ruling on the constitutionality of the carbon tax. They ruled the carbon tax is constitutional. So what now for Canadians who believe that climate change is real but are concerned with the financial burden we are placing on ourselves with a carbon tax? How will this imposition of a tax impact our oil and gas industry? And will any of this effort actually have an impact on reducing global carbon emissions? Well, joining us today to discuss this decision is Peter McCaffrey, president of the Alberta Institute, and Dr. Dwight Newman, professor of law at the University of Saskatchewan and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me today. I'm looking forward to this discussion on what happened with the Supreme Court of Canada just a few weeks ago. So I guess we'll start with you, Dr. Newman. Could you just give us a rundown or bring us up to speed as to what events transpired to get us to the place where this court case, the challenge was placed in front of the Supreme Court of Canada?
Well, it started out with Saskatchewan launching to its Court of Appeal what's called a reference question, where a province can ask its Court of Appeal to rule on a legal question. And through that, the province could challenge the carbon tax. So Saskatchewan started that out initially. Later on, Ontario and Alberta both launched similar kinds of reference cases. And the carbon tax was upheld by both the Saskatchewan and Ontario courts, but by divided courts. But the Alberta Court of Appeal would have struck it down, also by a divided court. So from a policy that started out with a lot of people thinking that it was just going to be upheld straightforwardly, there were serious legal questions there, and it was taken by way of appeals on up to the Supreme Court of Canada for the Supreme Court of Canada to rule on the case. Okay, and as we mentioned in March, they were in a divided court, though. They ruled, though, in favor of the constitutionality and that the government can proceed with this. Peter McCaffrey, were you surprised with this decision?
I wouldn't say that I was surprised overall. I think that a lot of people in Alberta were thinking that this is the way that the case was going to go. If anything, perhaps getting 3 justices dissenting was a surprise rather than 1 or 2. I feel like, though it might not feel like it yet, and maybe most Canadians haven't really noticed yet, that the Supreme Court's decision on this carbon tax has probably set in motion a series of events that will have a pretty significant impact on our country. And I think part of the reason for that is because actually the case isn't just about the carbon tax. It's about jurisdictional issues between the federal and provincial governments. And obviously that's something that's really impacting Alberta at the moment. Yes, most definitely. And I think you're right. This will have long-term ramifications for things down the road. And we'll get into that perhaps later in the show. So I found one thing that was interesting in the Supreme Court decision. It said that this is not a tax, it's carbon pricing. And I found that kind of strange. Is this just the court playing semantics? Peter, what are your thoughts? I mean, yes and no. One of the concerns that a lot of people have had about the Supreme Court of Canada is that really the court is more of a political body, and this isn't some recent claim. This goes right back to Confederation, where actually there wasn't even really a Supreme Court to begin with, and the concern is that the Supreme Court was looking for ways to justify allowing the federal government to impose these sorts of policies onto the provinces. Canada, unlike many other federal systems, is not meant to be a system where the federal government rules over the provinces. Right. The federal government and the provinces are meant to be equal and partners in Confederation. And the Constitution sets out clear jurisdictions where the federal government has its job to do and the provinces have their job to do. And really Alberta's concern, and the concerns of other provinces that joined in on this case as well, there were 6 provinces opposed to this case, was that this ruling and this carbon tax sets a precedent that will allow the federal government to intervene in all sorts of other areas of provincial jurisdiction. And the court tried to prevent that by, trying to claim that this was a very narrowly scoped decision that only affects this one very narrow issue. But, realistically, that's just not how court cases work.
And we're discussing the recent decision of the Supreme Court of Canada to grant the constitutionality of the federal carbon tax. So it was a divided court, 6-3, but that's what happened. So Dr. Newman, there were a couple things, again, there were many, it was about 200 pages, the decision was quite long, but there were a couple things that kind of stood out for me. Why was this tax found, I guess we'll start at the beginning. So why was this tax found to be constitutional? Because that's the crux of the matter here. Why was it found to be constitutional?
Right. And so, I mean, the main legal basis that the majority claims to have to hold this to be constitutional is a power called the national concern power. And they say that this tax fits within there because it's actually a setting of national standards on the matter of carbon pricing, and it fits a certain test that they articulate and develop in this case. It is based on prior cases, but it's been developed and adapted in this case, certainly. And they say that it fits within that federal power then. And on that basis, they uphold it. I guess at a deeper level or sort of a contextual level, I think it's upheld partly because the court is convinced of the seriousness of climate change issues and of the inability of the provinces to work cooperatively to address those. And so the court actually the majority writes quite a bit about their account of the seriousness of climate change and the alleged difficulties of the provinces dealing with that. And in a way, that's the background to this more specific legal test that they then utilize.
Now, is that kind of commentary on, a public policy or public situation, or is that normal? I found it a little, I mean, I haven't read so many court decisions, but I found that I was kind of a little surprised by that. As you mentioned, all the parties of the SEC declared that climate change is real, but the Supreme Court said that they even declared that it's caused by humans and poses a great threat to the future of humanity. But even still, I understand that the science is actually not unanimous as to what causes climate change. But here you have the Supreme Court of Canada saying, well, it's actually, we do know what it is, and it's caused by humans. Dr. Newman, again, is this unprecedented? I found it a little surprising.
Well, it's not unprecedented insofar as they would need sometimes to rule on the context for whether a matter fits within national concern or other powers for that matter. But it particularly arises in these legal tests. They may have gone further than they needed to in some of their statements. A lot of the statements, though, were based on things that weren't contested by the parties in the court. The federal government put in a lot of material on its view of climate change issues, as did a number of interveners. And the provinces largely didn't dispute that. And I guess the Supreme Court of Canada then went and wrote down what they had heard, in a sense, and that forms part of the backdrop for the decision.
Okay, so for Peter McCaffrey, I might just be me then who was a little surprised that there was such almost a lecturing of climate change from this decision. Were you surprised at all?
On that point, no, not particularly. And I think one of the reasons is that I think many other Albertans recognize that the Supreme Court of Canada is in reality a political body. And I'm not going to try to get into the technical details of the legal side of things. I'll leave that to the much more able Dr. Newman. But, I think the problem from an Albertan perspective is that Alberta is in confederation with all of the other provinces under a set of rules that, we thought we'd agreed to. We thought that Alberta had received concessions, particularly on natural resources and things like that, under Premier Lougheed. And the federal government, instead of negotiating and coming to an agreement as equals, as the Constitution lays out, has basically imposed their will on the provinces. And look, the reality is there are already processes in place in order to make a change if you believe that climate change is an existential threat to the country and to the planet. There's already parts of the Constitution that outline that in cases where both the federal and provincial government legislate, and if there's a conflict, well, then the federal law takes precedent. The process to go through, if you think that this is such an existential threat, is to negotiate with the provinces or even amend the Constitution to say, we think this is such an important issue that the federal government should be in control of this issue.
Okay,
the
but
problem,
let me
of course, from a
pause you.
political perspective is that you'd have to give up something as the federal government if you wanted to win that in negotiation.
We only have 20 seconds for a commercial, but let me ask you a question, or maybe I'll pose the question now, and then I'll have you give an opportunity for you to answer it when I get back. Some people will say, well, the government did play ball. The federal government did. They offered for Alberta to come up with their own carbon tax. We didn't have to impose it. They could have come up with their own. So could have Saskatchewan, so could have Ontario. So we did play fairly. I might disagree with that, but that's what some will say. So after this commercial break, I'd like you to answer that question. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're discussing the recent decision of the Supreme Court of Canada to declare the carbon tax, the federal carbon tax imposed in provinces, constitutional. And joining me is Dr. Dwight Newman and Peter McCaffrey. Peter, just before the break, I challenged you when you suggested that the federal government could have worked with the provinces and working with some kind of coming to an agreement. But I challenge you saying that, well, some critics will say, well, the federal government did try to work with provinces. They said, develop your own made-in-province carbon tax if you don't like ours. Do your own or we'll impose one. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the issue is that if you believe that the federal government's powers should be limited, and the federal government sits down with the provinces and says, hey, you should do this. Oh, and by the way, if you don't, we're going to force you to. that isn't really a negotiation. And, look, if we talked earlier about the federal government and the provinces meant to be partners and meant to be equals, if you flip the situation around and if Alberta went to the federal government and said, hey, do this, and if you don't, we'll force you to, that wouldn't work either way. So if the provinces and the federal government are meant to be equals, that's not the sort of approach you can take to resolve these issues.
Okay, so parlaying on that, Dr. Newman, so how does the concept of federalism play into this decision then? Or how will that now evolve?
Well, the majority decision is one that is a precedent now. And in centralizing power more than before, I think it has a lot of implications, although we're going to be sorting out for months whether there are enough constraints built into it. But it does say the federal government can create national standards in areas that previously weren't in federal jurisdiction. And I guess the dissents are very powerful on this point in saying that effectively they've now created a supervisory form of federalism, which is not consistent with the history or with what the provinces agreed to in terms of two equal orders of government, as has been referenced before. So I think there are profound implications for federalism. The fact that Quebec was intervening on the side of the provinces challenging the law is telling that this case had a lot of further implications. And I guess we'll have to see at a practical level how those play out over the months and years ahead. But it's a profound decision that does centralize power in ways that it wasn't before.
I agree. And in reading some of the critics or the reviews of the decision, there were quite a few alarm bells going off saying, hey, this is, like, as you just mentioned, this will set for lack of a better word, a dangerous precedent for going forward on when we see the federal government now intervening more in provincial matters. So one way they could potentially do this, and I'll ask you, Peter, about this, is does this decision mean that there could be other taxes on the way by the federal government, that they might want to impose further taxes or pricings, whatever the fun word will be of the day?
Well, I've joked with a few people, like, what's stopping the federal government now from saying, well, every province must have a minimum sales tax? And, that would be something that would be aimed directly at Alberta because we don't have a provincial sales tax. Now, obviously, legally, that would not come under the scope of what the courts ruled on this issue. But as we've discussed, precedents tend to drift over time and more will be open. Look, I think the bigger issue in Alberta specifically is we already have a lot of unrest in Alberta around Alberta's place in Confederation, right. Even under the previous deal that, a lot of Albertans thought wasn't fair. Now the federal government's basically taken the deal and ripped it up. And so a lot of people will be asking, look, if provinces are free to act so long as they do so in a way that the federal government is happy with, then really what is the point of having provinces? Because that's such a constraint on the ability for provinces to have different policies and do things in different ways that a lot of people are going to have to start questioning that, I think.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. And when you referenced that already Albertans were uneasy with the path that things seem to be headed with the federal government and the situation in Alberta right now, especially in the development of your resources. My question then is, Peter, are we now stoking more fires of the Wexit sentiment in Alberta?
Yeah, I think, as I said at the start, that a lot of people haven't quite realized the implications of this particular ruling yet. It is very technical and maybe there isn't a broad understanding. But I think over time, as this case allows for more and more intervention from the federal government into provincial jurisdiction, that will grow and grow as a problem. Really, the message that's been sent by this ruling is that provinces should not expect to be able to do things differently and do things in a way that's inconsistent with what the majority in Ottawa believe should be done.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting decision, and I think a lot of Canadians may not be familiar with the history of Confederation in Canada, but provinces do have their own jurisdictions, and it has to be respected by the federal government. And as we've just heard, that quite a few critics will be concerned with what this means going forward. Welcome back. We're concluding our discussion here on the recent Supreme Court of Canada ruling that said the carbon tax that was federally mandated is constitutional, much to the chagrin of many of the provinces, especially the three that were petitioning the federal Supreme Court of Canada. So let me ask this to you, Dr. Dwight Newman. Provinces have jurisdiction over their natural resources. Help me understand how this allowance allows for a carbon tax, because obviously there's going to be a lot of taxation now on these resources. But how does this work, given that we're supposed to have separation between the federal and the provincial governments, and now the federal government has been basically greenlit to carry on?
Sure. So the provinces in Canada have a lot of powers. Canada is a big place, a diverse place, and part of respecting that national diversity is respecting the powers of the different provinces. And amongst those are these powers related to natural resources. The federal government can sometimes slip into some sorts of roles where it regulates on some resource issues where there's a federal power that lets them do that. And so sometimes they do that through the fisheries power or through the criminal law power. In this case, the court said that they could do that through the National Concern Branch of the Peace, Order and Good Government power. But something about that does rankle with the control that the provinces are meant to have over natural resources, which in 1982, in the negotiations about the constitutional amendments, this was a crucial clause to provinces like not just Alberta, but Saskatchewan as well. Both said that was a deal breaker, the addition of a clause to clarify and make as secure as possible their natural resource jurisdiction. And now we're seeing something that seems to eat away at that right. to a lot of people in those provinces.
Yeah, it's quite a concerning precedent there. And then, of course, every province being different, I mean, if they have to go forward and impose a carbon tax, I guess at the end of the day, I ask myself, is really setting a price on carbon or carbon pricing or whatever term that is used by the federal government, I just like to call it a carbon tax. But is this really the best approach to addressing environmental concerns? And again, nobody's debating climate change. We all know it's real, but is really this the best way to approach it? Peter McCaffrey?
Well, without being facetious, the answer is maybe. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What we've lost from the Supreme Court of Canada case is the ability for provinces, different provinces, to try different things and see what works. And, the whole point of confederation is that no one size fits all, that different provinces are different, they can try different things. And through that competition, through that experimentation of different policies, we as a country gain because we are able to see which ideas work and which don't, and then we can adapt over time. What we have now is a single rule coming down from the federal government requiring everybody to do the same thing, and we lose that opportunity. And don't expect that this will stop with the current federal government either. This runs both ways. I think one of the dangers of this precedent is that this could be used by a future government of a different persuasion to try and require minimum standards or national standards for all sorts of other issues in ways that those supporting the carbon tax may not be happy with as well. So that's the other thing to consider. This will continue, and it could become an arms race between different political parties of imposing new rules from Ottawa.
Okay, and practically speaking, how will this imposition of the carbon tax impact the average Canadian family? I think everybody wants to know, especially coming out of the COVID economic downturn here, how will this new tax impact me at the end of the day?
Well, for many people, they will be receiving rebates, and the federal government has leaned on that argument very heavily. But the reality is that many other people will not receive in rebates the same amount they pay. It is a redistribution of wealth in that sense. For Alberta specifically, you talked about Alberta signing up to Confederation on a whole series of conditions around control of resources. I think for Albertans, the question now is, would we have signed up to the deal we now find ourselves in? And I think the pretty clear answer is no. The federal government demands approval of projects within Alberta. They demand approval and often reject pipelines. The threat of regulation prevents the construction of pipelines. And now our natural resources can be taxed and regulated by Ottawa as well. So for Albertans specifically, as opposed to all Canadians, basically we do not have control of our natural resources anymore.
Okay, well, we'll have to pick up this discussion another time. It's been very interesting. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
I think for me, my biggest takeaway was not that we're going to be having a federally mandated carbon tax, is what else might be down the road now that we have this precedent on the books. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.